June 28th, 1776, New York. General George Washington stood in the abandoned mansion, surrounded by his lieutenants. Outside, New York City was in chaos, tensions reaching boiling point in the sweltering summer heat. Treason was in the air. Washington lingered at the front door, his hand hovering over the knob. He wanted to stay in the calm of the mansion a few minutes longer, because his next appointment was grim. He was heading to an execution. He adjusted the blue sash that identified him as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and pushed the door open. Outside, he and his officers saddled their horses. As they rode through the city streets, the entire Continental Army fell in line behind them. Washington led his troops through the dense woods of northern Manhattan. He was flanked by members of his Life Guards, a special unit of elite soldiers meant to protect him from harm. Usually, Washington felt confident with his guards, but today he felt uneasy, exposed, unsafe. That was because 3 days ago, Washington had discovered a British plot to kidnap and possibly kill him. It had been constructed based on information leaked by some of his Life Guards. He eyed his protectors, knowing any one of them might have betrayed him. Finally, the 10,000 soldiers in the Continental Army arrived at a clearing in the forest quarter-mile outside the city. Everyone looked at the hastily assembled structure in the middle of the field, the gallows. Over the next hour, thousands of civilians eager to watch justice served joined the crowd. No one wanted to miss this historic moment. Between the Continental soldiers and ordinary citizens, it seemed like the entire population of New York had gathered together in the field. Washington took in the nervous, excited energy. He hoped the events of the day would make clear that if anyone betrayed America, they wouldn't live to tell the tale. On Washington's command, 80 soldiers armed with bayonets escorted a single prisoner to the gallows. The man's name was Thomas Hickey. He pushed his dark hair out of his eyes as he climbed the stairs on long, gangly legs. His face didn't betray any emotion, even though he was about to become the first person executed for treason against the United States of America. Washington watched as the hangman placed a noose around Hickey's neck. He felt a shiver of regret. He had liked this man, trusted this man. A Continental officer read the charges against Hickey. He had been stoic up until this point, but now he began to crack. Panic filled Hickey's eyes, and he trembled. The crowd booed and hissed at him. "I'm warning you, what comes next is much more dramatic." At dawn on March 4th, 1776, General George Washington stood at the top of a hill in Dorchester Heights, Massachusetts. He looked down on the city below. All was still. Boston was asleep, and for the moment in the hands of the British Army. But despite the calm, Washington's heart was pounding hard in his chest. He was about to make his move to free the city. The war was really only just beginning. The Continental Congress was still 2 months away from discussing its Declaration of Independence. At this point, they were still focused on negotiating with the Crown. They hoped to find a solution that would give the colonies more authority while maintaining British control. But things had not gone according to plan. Fighting had broken out. Congress created the Continental Army as a show of strength that would improve the colonies' chances of a fair deal. George Washington, already a national hero from past wars, was unanimously chosen as its leader. A few weeks later, New York City Mayor David Matthews boarded a rowboat. He slipped the boatsman a few shillings, and they set off into the harbor. His destination loomed a few hundred yards offshore, a merchant ship called the HMS Duchess of Gordon. Anchored nearby was a massive British warship, silently defending the Duchess from any unwanted guests. As the boatsman rowed, Matthews glanced nervously at shore. He had permission for this excursion to visit the tightly guarded Duchess. He told the Continental Army it was for a diplomatic matter, But if they discovered the true reason, Matthews might lose his office, and maybe his life. Matthews hated being on the water. He got seasick easily. But lately, he'd been feeling a lot safer in the harbor than on dry land. Even though he was the mayor of a major American city, Matthews was openly loyal to the British king. And after General Washington's army came marching into town in April 1776, he instantly became an outcast. In a noisy tavern in New York City, gunsmith Gilbert Forbes called out for another drink. He'd already had several to calm his nerves. In his field of work, war was good for business. But as a British loyalist in George Washington's New York, he was working for the enemy. If anyone found out he was making weapons for the crown, he could end up in prison. A crowd of ragtag Continental soldiers were singing drunkenly in the corner. They had been getting louder and more out of control all evening, but Forbes gritted his teeth and tried to ignore them. He looked forward to the day when the British Army would put these insolent farmers back in their place. The door to the tavern swung open, and Forbes looked up. He saw Mayor David Matthews walk in looking anxiously around like he might have been followed. Matthews stood out in the rough tavern. He was way too clean, too well dressed. Matthews saw Forbes and sat down at his table. His eyes shifted to the drunken soldiers in the corner. A few months later, in mid-May 1776, George Washington's officers were briefing him on New York City's lack of fortifications. But he was struggling to focus. He had a daunting task in front of him. The Continental Army needed to build defenses around the city to protect against British cannon fire, but it seemed impossible to armor the whole city, especially when it was surrounded by water. Plus, Washington's soldiers were easily distracted by alcohol, gambling, and brothels. Suddenly, one of Washington's lifeguards burst into the room. He was out of breath and holding up a letter. Washington grabbed it and ripped it open, but when he read it, his blood started to boil. The letter reported news of a Loyalist plot. The personal valet of a New York congressman had been caught smuggling information to Governor Tryon's ship in the harbor. Washington put the letter down and rubbed his temples. A month later, Thomas Hickey stood outside General Washington's office. The New York summer heat was sweltering, especially indoors. Hickey wanted nothing more than to get out of there. His mind wandered to the fantasy he'd been obsessing over for weeks, living on his own land and setting his own schedule. The thought of it never failed to bring a smile to his face. But he snapped out of his daydream as he heard Washington's voice through the wall. It wasn't completely clear, but the general seemed to be asking about Governor William Tryon and his involvement in conspiracies. Hickey leaned in closer. Then he heard the voice of John Jay, one of Washington's most trusted advisors. Jay said there were rumors that Tryon was bribing Continental soldiers to turn Loyalist right under their noses. Hickey felt his stomach cramp. They might already know he had flipped. As Hickey pressed his ear closer to listen, he heard Washington and his advisors close out the meeting. On June 15, 1776, Isaac Ketchum poked at his dismal jailhouse food. His ankles, which were bound in leg irons, were developing sores. He looked up at the fading light coming through the barred window at the top of his cell. His stomach churned. With each passing night he spent here, he felt less hope of ever getting out. Ketchum had been stuck in the prison under City Hall for a month, sharing a cell with a rotating cast of Loyalists and petty thieves. He was in for counterfeiting, even though he hadn't actually committed the crime himself. He had fallen in with some bad people and agreed to help transport the fake money they had made. But he got caught. And now, as a widower and father of 6, his children were left to fend for themselves. He had sent several appeal letters to the New York Provincial Congress, pleading his innocence, but had gotten no response. 2 days later, On June 17th, 1776, Isaac Ketchum fidgeted with the chains around his wrists. He was sitting outside the council chamber at City Hall. It was the first time he'd been above ground in over a month. He tried to savor the fresh air as long as he could. He had written to the New York Provincial Congress that he had urgent information about a Loyalist plot. His freedom now rested on them believing him. If they didn't, they'd send him right back to rot in the prison. The thought of never seeing his children again made his heart ache. The door to the council chamber swung open. A man in a coat and breeches walked out. He introduced himself as John Jay. He asked Ketchum to come inside. Ketchum shuffled in as quickly as his leg irons would allow. Inside, he saw the rest of the Provincial Congress waiting, 25 men in powdered wigs. Jay asked Ketchum to give his information. A week later, on June 23rd, 1776, John Jay watched as the Loyalist gunsmith Gilbert Forbes walked into the chamber at City Hall. His hands and ankles were in chains. Jay felt a strange mix of fear and excitement bubbling in his stomach. Congress had recently chosen him and 2 other men to form the Committee on Conspiracies. Their mission was to report to General Washington on counter-espionage, and they were close to uncovering the secret plot against him. Things had moved quickly since Isaac Ketchum's testimony. The committee knew they needed to go after the Loyalists, bribing Continental soldiers to flip sides. Since Tryon was still untouchable on his ship in the harbor, Jay and the committee settled for the next best thing, arresting New York's Loyalist mayor, David Matthews. Matthews had been doing Tryon's bidding for too long, and Jay had finally had enough. On Washington's orders, they raided Matthews' estate in the middle of the night. George Washington was in his office poring over a map of the city when John Jay burst in. He handed Washington a piece of paper. Washington took it. It was a list of names. He recognized many of them. He knew what this meant. His soldiers, his lifeguards had betrayed him. Washington slumped down at his desk. His army was coming apart at the seams, right when they needed to band together. He sat motionless, trying to decide what to do next. Finally, Washington spoke. He thanked Jay for a job well done. The Committee on Conspiracies had uncovered the plot before the British could act on it. They had almost certainly saved his life. Still, he didn't want anyone to know what the committee had found. If they were to go after every person involved in the scheme, it would expose far too many cracks. The morale of the Continental Army might be ruined beyond repair. The British Army was arriving in only a few days. He couldn't risk it.